Today we're going to talk about a man who stared down the impossible, a military commander who stood against an empire so huge, so powerful, that it felt, well, completely invincible. This is the story of Tran Hung Dao and how he broke that empire.
All right, let's just paint a picture here. It's the 13th century, and if you're looking around trying to figure out who's going to rule the world, there is only one safe bet: the Mongol Empire. And look, this wasn't just another kingdom. This was a force of nature, a global juggernaut that was basically rewriting the entire rulebook on conquest.
I mean, their reach was just staggering. They swept out from the steppes of Asia, and entire civilizations that had been around for centuries just disappeared. They rolled right through the great cities of the Middle East, places like Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, and just left absolute devastation behind. They were redrawing the map with terrifying speed.
And what about Europe? Well, even their legendary armored knights, the medieval version of a tank, they were just no match. Seriously. These guys were supposed to be the best of the best, but they were completely and systematically crushed. The Mongol cavalry was just too fast, their tactics were too clever, they were simply outmaneuvered and totally overwhelmed.
And if you look back at Asia, their home turf, they took down the mighty Jin dynasty in northern China. Now, this was a massive empire. We're talking over 50 million people. But to the Mongols, it was just another Tuesday. You gotta understand, they didn't just win battles. They literally erased entire empires from the map.
So, it begs the question, right? The question on everyone's mind back then. If the great caliphates, the European knights, the massive empires of China, if none of them could stop this machine, who on earth could? It really felt like there was no one left.
And then, something totally out of left field happens. A tiny nation, a fraction of the size of the places the Mongols had already steamrolled, just decided to stand its ground, to say no.
That nation was called Dai Viet. That's the historical name for what we now know as Vietnam, a very small country facing a very, very big problem.
And at the absolute center of this incredible story of defiance was one man, a military leader whose name would become a legend in Vietnamese history for centuries to come: Tran Hung Dao. He was the guy tasked with doing the impossible.
Okay, so before we jump into the epic battles and all that amazing strategy, we really have to understand the man himself. Because to get how he beat the world's greatest army, you first have to look at this one single choice he made years before any Mongol soldier even set foot in his country.
You see, the legend of this guy wasn't really born on the battlefield. Not at first, anyway. It was forged in the fire of a personal crisis, a test of his character, not just his skill with the sword.
So his birth name was Tran Quoc Tuyen. He was a prince, a member of the royal Tran dynasty. But his family situation, it was complicated. His father had this deep, bitter grudge against the king, which created all this tension bubbling right under the surface of the royal court.
And this is where it gets wild. As his father lay dying, he gave his son a direct command. He said, "You must take revenge for me. You must take the throne." Think about that. This isn't just a suggestion. It's an order to start a civil war and grab power for yourself.
So here he is at this massive crossroads. On one side, you've got the path of ambition. Do what his father wanted, avenge the family's honor, and become the king. And on the other side, the path of duty. Put the country first. Put its safety and stability above any personal problem, any personal gain.
And in a moment that would literally define his entire life, Tran Quoc Tuyen did something almost no one in his position would do. He looked at the throne, at all that power, and he walked away. He refused his father's command. He chose duty.
And this is the key to everything. That decision to put the nation above himself is why he's not just remembered as some great general in Vietnam. He's revered as a selfless, almost saintly figure, a true patriot. And that single act proved to everyone, including the king he could have overthrown, that he was the only man they could trust when the real storm finally arrived.
So, we know he had this unshakable loyalty. That was his foundation. But look, to take on the Mongols, you need a little more than just a strong moral compass. You need to be an absolutely brilliant commander.
And what made him so perfect for this job was this incredibly rare mix of talents. The guy was a brilliant strategist, always seeing the big picture. He was deeply educated in military history, so he learned from everyone who came before him. And he was famously calm, even when everything was falling apart. And all of that was built on top of that fierce, unbreakable loyalty. This combination gave him this amazing reputation. To his enemies, the Mongols, he was someone to be absolutely feared, a cunning, dangerous opponent you could never, ever underestimate.
But to his own men, the soldiers of Dai Viet, they adored him. They would follow him anywhere because they knew, deep in their bones, that he put them and their country above everything else.
So as that Mongol threat went from being a distant rumor to a very real danger right on their border, there was no debate in the royal court. There's no question. There was only one person to lead the defense.
And just like that, the nation had its champion. The man who had once refused a crown was now being asked to save it. The entire fate of Dai Viet was on his shoulders.
And on the horizon, the biggest, baddest, most disciplined army on the entire planet was getting ready to march.
Which, of course, brings us to the ultimate question. We've met the man of principle, the hero forged by loyalty. But let's be real, character alone doesn't stop the world's greatest war machine. So how did he do it? The story of his strategy, of using the land itself, is a masterclass, and it's proof that even the most powerful empires can be broken.
You know, every now and then, history gives us one of those perfect underdog stories. And this is one of the all-time greats. It's the classic tale of a seemingly unbeatable empire running smack into a kingdom that just refused to break. So, let's get into how a small, rice-farming nation managed to stop the most powerful war machine on the entire planet. Okay, so first, we've got to set the scene. We're in the 13th century, and the Mongol Empire is an absolute force of nature. I mean, they had already conquered the Song dynasty in China, which was, without a doubt, the superpower of Asia. To pretty much everyone else in the world, these guys looked completely unstoppable. So, when the Mongol generals looked south towards what we now call Vietnam, back then it was known as Dai Viet, what do you think they saw? They saw a small agricultural kingdom. In their minds, this was just a speed bump, an easy win on their way to conquering all of Southeast Asia. All right, Section 1, an unstoppable empire. Let's take a closer look at the two sides in this incredible conflict. And you can really see the mismatch right here. I mean, on one side, you have the Mongol Empire, Asia's massive continental superpower. And on the other, Dai Viet, a small, rice-farming kingdom. On paper, this shouldn't even be a fair fight. It looks like a total blowout. So, Section 2, a kingdom that refused. But Dai Viet had a secret weapon, and it wasn't a bigger army. It was the mind of a brilliant general. His name was Tran Hung Dao, and he understood something critical that the Mongols didn't. You don't beat a giant by playing the giant's game. He just completely threw out the rule book. The idea of meeting the Mongols in a huge, head-on battle in an open field, he knew that was basically suicide. So instead, he chose a totally different, much smarter path. He was going to fight a war the Mongols had never seen before. And this new strategy wasn't about strength. It was all about intelligence. Instead of fighting, the Vietnamese army would just disappear. They evacuated entire villages, leaving nothing behind for the invaders. They used lightning-fast hit-and-run tactics, striking and then melting right back into the jungle. Every single move was designed to wear down and frustrate this massive army. And guess what? It worked. It worked perfectly. The Mongols' greatest strength, their enormous, fast-moving army, suddenly became their greatest weakness. An army that big needs a ton of food, but with their supply lines cut and the countryside totally empty, they were slowly being starved out. And get this wasn't a one-time fluke. They had already pushed back a Mongol invasion way back in 1258, and then they did it again in 1284. Each time, the huge invading army retreated, just exhausted and humiliated. But by 1287, the Mongols had had enough. They were coming back one last time, and they were bringing everything they had. Section 3, the final invasion. This was it, the showdown. The Mongols were determined to crush Dai Viet once and for all. And this time, they were coming by sea. And they were not holding back. We're talking about a massive fleet carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, all descending on this tiny kingdom. This wasn't just an invasion. This was an existential threat. This force was designed to completely wipe them off the map. But General Tran Hung Dao had been preparing for this moment. He knew exactly where he would make his final stand, the Bach Dang River. And its geography was key. It was narrow, it was winding, and it had these incredibly powerful tides that were as predictable as clockwork. It was, in other words, the perfect place for a trap. Okay, Section 4, the River Trap. What they did next was so brilliant, it would go down as one of the most ingenious naval strategies in all of military history.
So here's how this perfect trap worked. Step 1. In secret, his soldiers planted thousands of huge, iron-tipped wooden stakes deep into the riverbed. Step 2. A small group of Vietnamese boats sailed out and baited the massive Mongol fleet, luring them deep into the river during high tide when the water completely covered the hidden stakes. Step 3. They just waited. As the tide went out, those deadly stakes started to emerge from the water. And finally, step 4, with the Mongol fleet trapped, impaled, and in chaos, the Vietnamese ambush began from all sides.
Can you just imagine the scene? These massive Mongol warships suddenly grinding to a halt. The horrifying sound of splintering wood as the stakes just ripped through their hulls. The entire fleet was completely stuck, crashing into each other as absolute chaos and panic took over. Section 5. The Empire's End. It was a complete and utter disaster for the Mongols. The battle was over almost as quickly as it began. And for the Mongol war machine, this was the end of the line. The destruction was just total. As one historical account puts it, by nightfall, the great Mongol fleet was gone, burned, sunk, or captured. The most powerful naval force in Asia had been completely and totally obliterated. And a quick look at the numbers really shows you the scale of this catastrophe for the Mongols. The vast, vast majority of their fleet was either destroyed or captured. Just a tiny fraction of that massive invasion force ever made it home. It was an absolute victory for Dai Viet. And the defeat was so catastrophic, so absolute, that the Mongols never even tried to invade again. Their grand ambition to conquer all of Southeast Asia, it was shattered right there on the banks of the Bach Dang River.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How often can you point to one single battle on one single day and say, that's it, that's where history turned? The Battle of Bach Dang is one of those incredibly rare moments, a powerful reminder of how intelligence, bravery, and a home field advantage can overcome even the most impossible odds. You ever hear about an army that just couldn't be beaten? I mean, a real-life juggernaut? Okay, now what if I told you a tiny kingdom didn't just stand up to them, but beat them? And get this, 3 times. This is seriously one of the most unbelievable upsets in all of history. It's a story all about how they made the impossible, well, possible. So yeah, that's the big question, right? How did they pull it off? You have to picture it, the 13th century Mongol Empire. They were like a force of nature, a tidal wave just rolling over everything. Cities, armies, whole civilizations, they all just crumbled. But then there was this one small kingdom in Southeast Asia that just refused to fall. I mean, how? To really get what a big deal this is, you've got to understand the sheer scale we're talking about here. The Mongol war machine wasn't just some army. No, it was a whole empire built on one thing, conquest. I'm talking from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Central Europe. These guys were disciplined, they were ruthless, and they were tactical geniuses. Seriously, people thought they were invincible. 3, not 1, not 2, 3 separate times, that little kingdom, called Dai Viet, faced down 3 massive Mongol invasions, and they won every single time. But here's the thing. It wasn't just about having a clever battle plan. The secret to how they did it, well, it all started with one man, their leader. And that brings us to the hero of our story, the Supreme Commander, Tran Hung Dao. Now, this guy is a legend, and not just for his battlefield smarts. His real legacy comes down to one single massive choice he made, a choice that would literally decide the fate of his country. I mean, just look at this matchup. It's almost comical. On one side, you have the global superpower of the era. We're talking basically limitless resources, an enormous army. And on the other side, a small kingdom literally fighting to survive. It's the ultimate David versus Goliath story. And let me tell you, David was going to need a lot more than a slingshot this time. Okay, so here's the real kicker. Tran Hung Dao had every reason to be angry with his own king. I'm talking deep, personal family drama with the royal court. He could have just sat back and let the kingdom tear itself apart from the inside, but he didn't. He made this legendary choice to put the survival of his nation way ahead of his own personal beef. He united everybody against the one enemy that mattered, and that unity, that became their secret weapon. So, okay, they're all united. Now what? How do you actually fight these guys? Going head-to-head with the Mongols on an open battlefield, that's just a suicide mission. So they didn't. Instead, they used the one thing they had that the Mongols didn't:
an intimate knowledge of their own homeland. They literally turned the landscape into a weapon. And the strategy was honestly brilliant. It had two parts. Part one, wear the enemy down. As the huge Mongol army pushed forward, they'd find nothing. Empty villages, burned fields. The Vietnamese forces refused to fight a big, pitched battle. Instead, it was just constant, annoying, draining little hit-and-run attacks. And then, once the Mongols were tired, frustrated, and stretched thin, it was time for part two, the trap. Now, by the third time around, the Mongols had learned a thing or two. They decided to rely on a massive naval fleet to bring in supplies. Smart, right? On the open water, they figured they were completely safe. But here's the thing. Tran Hung Dao knew the local waterways like the back of his hand. And he had a plan to turn their biggest advantage, that giant fleet on the river, into their greatest nightmare.
And this is where it gets just genius. Check this out. First, a small Vietnamese fleet beats the Mongol Navy, luring them deep into the Bach Dang River. It's high tide, so everything looks fine. They just look like they're retreating. But hidden just below the surface was a deadly secret, a whole forest of huge, sharpened, iron-tipped wooden stakes. Step two, they just wait. They wait for the tide to go out, and as the water level drops, boom, the entire Mongol fleet gets impaled on the stakes. They're stuck, helpless. And that's when the Vietnamese forces strike. It was an absolute catastrophe for the Mongols, and one of the most brilliant naval victories ever.
You know, beating the world's #1 superpower 3 times in a row, yeah, that's enough to make you a legend. But Tran Hung Dao's story doesn't end on the battlefield, not even close. His true legacy is about the ideas he passed on, ideas that are still powerful today. So how did he do that? Well, after that final incredible victory, he didn't just throw a parade. He sat down and he wrote. The result was this document, Hic Tun Si, or The Call to the Soldiers. And this became his masterpiece. It wasn't just some rah-rah, we won speech. No, it was a blueprint for what it means to lead and what it means to be a nation. People studied it for centuries.
So why do we still talk about him today? What makes him such a hero? It's all right here. He chose his country over his own personal revenge. He completely outsmarted the greatest military minds on the planet. And, maybe most importantly, he proved that a nation, no matter how small, is basically unbeatable when it's truly united. His ideas about loyalty and courage became the bedrock of their culture.
And it all boiled down to these core ideas: courage, loyalty, discipline, and a deep love for your homeland. He wasn't just teaching tactics, he was teaching purpose. He understood that it wasn't just about how you fight, but why you fight. And he knew that the spirit of an army, that fire inside, well, that's a weapon far more powerful than any sword or spear.
And that's why this story is so much bigger than just one country or one battle. It's universal. It's a lesson for every underdog out there. It shows that with smart thinking, total unity, and a real passion for what you're defending, you can stand up to pretty much any force, no matter how big or scary it seems.
So at the end of the day, that's really the heart of it. The most incredible thing Tran Hung Dao did wasn't just beating an empire. It was taking something that could have been a weakness, his own personal anger, and turning it into the nation's greatest strength, being united. He proved that real power isn't about the size of your army, it's about the strength of your people's will. And that really makes you wonder, right? What other impossible challenges could we overcome if we were all truly united for a single cause?